The black clouds came down from the Absaroka Range on November 2, 1887, rolling across the peaks like a funeral shroud drawn over the face of the dying. At noon, the temperature in Timber Creek stood at 26 degrees and falling, and the old men who gathered outside the general store to smoke their pipes and tell lies fell silent one by one as they watched the sky. There were 847 souls in Timber Creek that autumn, spread across the valley and into the foothills, and not one among them could remember clouds so dark arriving so early in the season. The railroad had ceased running 3 days prior, the track somewhere east of Casper buried under early snow, and the supply wagons that should have arrived from the territorial capital were now 22 days overdue. The shelves in Pemberton's general store held perhaps 6 weeks of flour at normal consumption, 4 weeks of salt pork, and 3 weeks of coffee. No one spoke of these numbers aloud, but every man who stood watching those clouds knew them in his bones. What came next would be remembered for generations as the starving winter, though in the early days of November no one yet knew to call it that. They knew only that the elk had come down from the high country 6 weeks ahead of schedule, that the rabbits trapped in the foothills wore pelts thick as beaver, and that the birds had gone silent in a way that pressed against the ears like cotton wool. The wind that preceded those black clouds carried the smell of iron and old snow, and it cut through wool coats as though they were made of paper. 18 months earlier, in the spring of 1886, a wagon had creaked into Timber Creek bearing a single occupant, and the modest possessions of a life interrupted. The man who drove that wagon was Garrett Holbrook, 43 years of age, his face weathered to the color and texture of old leather, his hands calloused from work that predated his journey west. He had buried his wife Sarah 11 days before reaching Timber Creek, wrapped her in the quilt her mother had made for their wedding, and laid her in a grave outside a nameless way station where the fever had finally taken her. The grave marker he carved himself from a piece of oak salvaged from their broken wagon wheel, and he had stood before it for the better part of an hour before climbing back onto the seat and continuing west. There was nothing left for him in Pennsylvania, where they had started, and nothing waiting for him in Oregon, where they had meant to finish. Wyoming Territory was as good a place as any for a man with no destination, and no one left to care whether he found one. His grandmother Elsa had come to America from Bavaria in 1829, a girl of 16 who spoke no English and carried nothing but a Bible and a knowledge of stone that her father had beaten into her alongside the Scriptures. She had settled in the Appalachian foothills of what would become West Virginia, and there she had survived the winters of 1832 and 1834, winters that killed her neighbors by the score while she sat warm in the bermed stone longhouse she had built with her own hands into the side of a hill. The earth remembers warmth longer than the air, she had told young Garrett when he was still a boy not yet old enough to lift a proper stone. She had taken him to her longhouse, then nearly 40 years old and still standing solid, and shown him how the walls sweated in summer because the stone held the cool of spring, how the banked earth held the heat of autumn fires well into the coldest months. She had died in 1871, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 58, and Garrett had wept at her graveside as he would weep for no one else until he buried Sarah 15 years later. But her voice remained with him, clear as creek water, and her knowledge lived in his hands. The land Garrett chose in Timber Creek cost him $14, paid to a speculator in Casper who had been trying to unload the parcel for 3 years without success. 12 acres of rocky slope on the western edge of the valley, south-facing but treeless, studded with outcroppings of native sandstone that made farming impossible and ranching impractical. The locals called it the Worthless 12, and more than one man had laughed openly when Garrett signed the papers. But Garrett saw what they could not see, what his grandmother had taught him to look for. He saw the natural windbreak formed by the ridge that curved around the northern edge of the property. He saw the southern exposure that would catch winter sun from dawn until dusk. He saw the stone, endless stone, waiting to be shaped and stacked and mortared into walls that would stand for 100 years. And he saw the spring that bubbled up through the rocks near the base of the slope, cold and clean and flowing year-round. His Grulla mare, Ivy, had been with him since Pennsylvania, a blue-gray horse with black points and a disposition as steady as stone. She had carried Sarah's coffin to the grave on a makeshift sledge, and she had pulled the wagon the remaining 400 miles without complaint. Garrett spoke to her as he would speak to a person, and she listened with ears that swiveled to track his voice, and between them there existed an understanding that required no words. When he walked the worthless 12 for the first time, Ivy walked beside him, and when he stood at the place where the slope met the ridge and the stone outcropping formed a natural half-wall, she stopped and stood still, as though she too recognized that this was the place. The construction began in May of 1886 and continued for 14 months. Garrett dug first, cutting 8 feet down into the hillside with pick and shovel, carting away the rocky soil in loads that Ivy pulled to a growing pile at the edge of the property. The work was slow and solitary, and more than once he paused to wipe the sweat from his face and wonder whether madness had taken him at last. But then his grandmother's voice would come to him, steady and certain, and he would lift the pick again and swing. The walls rose 3 feet thick, mortared with a mixture of sand, lime, and clay that Garrett prepared according to his grandmother's formula. Each stone he chose by hand, fitting them together like the pieces of a puzzle that existed only in his mind. The completed structure measured 60 feet in length and 20 feet in width, its roof made of heavy timbers salvaged from a collapsed barn 20 miles distant, covered with 18 inches of sod that would green in spring and turn gold in autumn. From the road that passed a quarter-mile below, the longhouse was nearly invisible. Only the massive stone chimney rising from the hillside and the row of south-facing windows set deep in the thick walls betrayed its presence. Inside, Garrett built according to plans his grandmother had drawn in the dirt floor of her own longhouse 50 years before. The baking oven occupied the eastern end, its firebox built directly into the hillside so that the earth itself became part of its insulation. Once heated by a proper firing, the oven would hold its warmth for 20 hours, maintaining a temperature suitable for bread long after the flames had died to embers. The root cellars he carved into the northern wall, 3 chambers that stayed cool in summer and above freezing in winter, lined with shelves that would eventually hold 2,000 pounds of preserved food. Sleeping quarters for 12 occupied the western end, simple bunks built into the walls in the manner of a ship's berths, and beneath the floor, fed by the spring he had diverted through a channel lined with flat stones, lay a cistern that would provide fresh water even if the world above lay buried under 20 feet of snow. If you want to know more about frontier survival techniques, there is a video on this channel that explores how early settlers used the land itself as insulation against extreme weather, and you might find it interesting. The total cost of materials came to $127. The lime he purchased from a kiln operator in Casper, $32 for enough to mortar the entire structure twice over. The glass for the windows cost $18, shipped from Chicago and carried the final 100 miles by wagon. The iron hardware, hinges and latches, and the heavy door fittings, another $23 from the blacksmith in Timber Creek, who took Garrett's money without comment but watched him with the wary eyes of a man observing something he did not understand. The remainder went to timber, rope, nails, and the coal that would feed the oven through the long months ahead. 14 months of labor, from the first shovelful of earth to the final stone set in place. Garrett worked alone except for Ivy, who pulled the stones he could not carry and stood patient while he loaded the sledge again and again. He grew leaner as the months passed, and harder, and the grief that had driven him west settled into something quieter, something that lived in his chest like an ember that would not quite die. Sarah would have loved this place, he thought sometimes, standing in the half-finished longhouse as the evening light slanted through the windows. She would have filled these shelves with preserves and these walls with laughter. But Sarah was gone, and the walls held only silence. And Garrett worked on, because work was the only answer he had ever known for sorrow. The people of Timber Creek watched his progress with a curiosity that gradually curdled into something else. A proper house stood above the ground, with clapboard walls and shingled roof and windows that looked out upon the world instead of into the earth. A proper man built such a house and painted it white and hung curtains in the windows so that his neighbors could see he was civilized. What Garrett Holbrook built was something other, something that disappeared into the hillside like a creature returning to its burrow. The children who passed on the road below stared and whispered, and their parents pulled them along with sharp words and backward glances. By September of 1887, when the longhouse stood complete and the root cellars began to fill with the harvest Garrett had grown in the small garden plot he had carved from the rocky soil, the whispers had grown loud enough to reach his ears. He heard them in town when he came for supplies, caught them in the silences that fell when he entered the general store, saw them in the way the women gathered their skirts, and turned away when he passed on the street. But Garrett said nothing, and he continued his preparations. And if the people of Timber Creek thought him strange for building his home beneath the earth, that was their concern, and not his. His grandmother had faced the same whispers in her time, the same sidelong glances and muttered suspicions, and she had outlived every soul who doubted her. The earth remembers, she had told him, and Garrett remembered too. The mockery found its voice on the 23rd of September, 1887, at a town council meeting held in the back room of the Timber Creek Hotel. Garrett was not present, had not been invited, but the words spoken there traveled through the town like smoke through a drafty house, reaching his ears before the week was out. Knox Ashcroft presided over that meeting as he presided over most gatherings of consequence in Timber Creek. He owned the Broken Ranch, 1,200 acres of prime grazing land that stretched from the valley floor to the foothills of the Absaroka Range. He held mortgages on half the businesses in town and paper on a quarter of the homesteads besides. When Knox Ashcroft spoke, men listened, not because his words carried wisdom, but because his signature carried weight. He was 51 years old that autumn, prosperous and proud, his white beard trimmed to a point and his waistcoat stretched tight across a belly that had never known hunger. The matter before the council that evening was the proposed extension of the town's main street, a project that would require the clearing of several acres of scrubland on the western edge of the valley. Someone, no one would later admit to being the first, mentioned that the proposed route would pass within sight of the Holbrook property. The comment was innocent enough, a simple observation of geography, but it opened a door that Knox Ashcroft walked through with evident pleasure. "The Gopher Hole," he said, and the room fell silent. The words hung in the air for a moment before understanding rippled through the assembled men, followed by laughter that built slowly and then crashed like a wave. Knox Ashcroft smiled, pleased with his creation, and continued in the manner of a man who has discovered a rich vein and means to mine it thoroughly. "A grown man playing in the dirt like a child," he declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Building a cave instead of a proper house. What manner of man digs himself into the earth like a badger? What next? Shall he eat worms and grubs for his supper? Shall he line his walls with roots and call himself civilized?" There is a video on this channel that examines how social pressure and mockery shaped frontier communities, and you might find it relevant to understanding scenes like this one. The laughter came again, louder now, and Knox Ashcroft basked in it like a man warming himself before a fire. He had more to say, and he said it, each word chosen for maximum effect and delivered with the timing of a performer who knows his audience well. "I have seen that structure from the road," he continued. "If one can call it a structure, it looks for all the world like a burial mound. And perhaps that is fitting, for any man who would choose to live in such a place has clearly buried his good sense, along with his dignity. The savages of this territory build their lodges above the ground like proper beings. Only the mole and the prairie dog make their homes beneath the earth, and now, it seems, Garrett Holbrook has joined their company. The meeting moved on to other business, but the name stuck. Within a week, every soul in Timber Creek knew the Gopher Hole, and within 2 weeks, not a man or woman in town would speak of Garrett Holbrook's property by any other name. The children took up the phrase with particular enthusiasm, shouting it at one another in their games, and more than once Garrett heard it carried on the wind as he worked in his garden or walked the road to town. He heard other things, too, in the days that followed. He heard that Margaret Ashcroft, Knox's wife and the undisputed arbiter of Timber Creek society, had removed his name from the invitation list for the Harvest Social. He heard that the ladies' quilting circle had discussed his absence at their last meeting, not with regret but with satisfaction, agreeing among themselves that a man who lived like a burrowing animal could hardly be expected to contribute to civilized gatherings. He heard that the merchants who had once extended him credit now demanded cash payment, and that more than one had suggested he take his business elsewhere if he found their terms unsuitable. The exclusion organized itself with the efficiency of a military campaign, and Margaret Ashcroft commanded it with the skill of a general. She was 47 years old, handsome rather than beautiful, her gray-streaked hair always pinned in precise arrangements that spoke of time and resources most women in Timber Creek could not spare. She had been born Margaret Sinclair in Boston, the daughter of a shipping merchant, and she had never quite forgiven the circumstances that had brought her west to this rough valley among these rough people. Knox Ashcroft's money insulated her from the worst indignities of frontier life, but it could not insulate her from the presence of individuals she deemed beneath her notice, and so she had made it her particular project to ensure that such individuals understood their place. Garrett Holbrook, with his strange dwelling and his stranger ways, his silence and his solitude, his refusal to seek the approval of his betters, represented everything Margaret Ashcroft despised about the frontier. He was disorder incarnate, a man who had looked upon the proper order of things and chosen to build his own order instead, and for this she could not forgive him. "The man is clearly touched," she announced at her weekly tea, surrounded by the wives of the town's leading citizens. "No sane person would live as he does, burrowed into the earth like some creature of the night. I should not be surprised to learn that he practices unholy arts in that cave of his, conjuring spirits and brewing potions. Have you noticed how his garden grows while others struggle? No natural explanation can account for it." The accusation of witchcraft was never spoken plainly enough to constitute slander, but it hovered at the edges of conversation, a shadow that clung to Garrett's name wherever it was mentioned. The children who shouted "Gopher Hole" in their games added gestures meant to ward off evil, and their parents did not correct them. The merchant who sold Garrett his flour began to make the sign of the cross after counting his coins, and the blacksmith who had forged the iron hardware for the longhouse grew reluctant to meet Garrett's eyes. Through it all, Garrett worked and said nothing. He filled his root cellars with the harvest from his garden, cabbage and turnips and potatoes and onions, layered in straw and sand according to his grandmother's methods. He purchased flour in quantities that raised eyebrows, 50 pounds and then 50 more, storing it in sealed bins that would keep out moisture and vermin. He bought salt by the sack and sugar by the crate, dried beans and dried corn and dried apples, coffee and tea and honey, candles and lamp oil and coal. The shelves in his root cellars filled slowly but steadily, and the weight of his preparations pressed into the stone floors like a promise. October brought the first hard frost, and with it the final confrontation that would seal Garrett's position in Timber Creek society. He had come to town for coal, his wagon empty and his purse heavy with the coins he had saved from a summer of careful labor. The coal merchant, a man named Elwood Sutter who had sold to Garrett before without incident, met him at the gate of his yard with a face like stone. "No coal," Sutter said. Garrett regarded him calmly. "I have coin." "No coal for you," Sutter repeated. "Ashcroft says your money is not good here, and Ashcroft holds my note. Take your coin elsewhere, gopher." The nickname fell from his lips with practiced ease, and behind him, in the yard where the black mountains of coal waited for distribution, two of his workers laughed. Garrett stood very still for a moment, and something moved behind his eyes, something cold and old and patient. Then he turned and walked back to his wagon without a word. He drove the wagon 3 miles out of town to a smaller operation run by an independent man named Thomas Clearwater, who had no paper with Knox Ashcroft and no love for the games of Timber Creek society. Clearwater sold him coal without comment, and Garrett loaded the wagon himself, piece by piece, until the springs groaned under the weight. When he was finished, he paid in full and added an extra $1 for the trouble. "They are making you unwelcome," Clearwater observed, not unkindly. "They are," Garrett agreed. "Does it trouble you?" Garrett considered the question as he climbed onto the wagon seat, his hands steady on the reins. When he spoke, his voice was calm and resolute, carrying the weight of certainty that required no defense. Let them build their castles in the wind. Stone remembers what wood forgets. He drove home in the afternoon light, the coal piled high behind him, and did not look back. If you want to understand more about how early settlers read natural signs to predict severe weather, there is a video on this channel that covers exactly that topic. The warning signs began in earnest the second week of October. Garrett had been watching for them since summer, reading the land and sky with the eyes his grandmother had trained, and now they appeared one after another like words in a sentence that spelled catastrophe. The beaver dams on the creek that ran through the lower valley rose 3 feet higher than any local could remember seeing them. The creatures worked with desperate energy, piling mud and branches as though their lives depended upon it, which Garrett knew they did. The geese that had always waited until the last week of October to begin their southern migration departed on the 9th, their ragged formations crossing the sky in such numbers that their honking drowned out conversation for the better part of an hour. The woolly caterpillars that appeared on the fence posts and tree trunks wore coats of solid black without a single brown band, a sign that Garrett's grandmother had taught him to read as the certain harbinger of a killing winter. The elk came down from the high country 6 weeks early, driven from their summer range by something they sensed and men could not. They moved through the valley in herds of unusual size, pausing to graze but never staying long, always moving south and always moving with urgency. The deer followed, and then the smaller creatures, rabbits and foxes and even the wolves that hunted them, all flowing through the land like water seeking lower ground. Ivy knew too. The Grulla mare grew a winter coat heavier than any Garrett had seen in their years together, her blue-gray hide disappearing under a layer of fur so thick he could bury his fingers to the second knuckle without touching skin. She grew restless in the evenings, pawing at the floor of her shelter as though seeking to dig her way to some deeper place, and when the wind came from the north she stood with her head turned away and her eyes closed, bracing against something that had not yet arrived. Garrett spoke to her on the evening of October 15th, as the sun set red and angry over the Absaroka Range, and the first stars appeared in a sky that seemed colder than any he could remember. He had just finished filling the last shelf in the easternmost root cellar, 2,000 pounds of preserved food packed and sealed and waiting, and he stood with his hand on her neck and his voice low. "They will not listen," he said. "I have tried. The blacksmith laughed when I spoke of the rabbit pelts, and the merchant told me that Ashcroft's almanac predicts a mild winter. But you know, do you not? You have known for weeks." Ivy turned her head and regarded him with one dark eye, steady and patient and infinitely wise. They will mock the gopher hole until they stand frozen in its doorway, Garrett continued, his voice dropping lower still. And then they will not mock. They will beg. And I will let them in, because that is what my grandmother would have done, and because Sarah would never forgive me if I turned hungry souls away from warmth. But I will remember, Ivy. I will remember every word they have spoken and every door they have closed. And when the spring comes, if the spring comes, the remembering will matter. There is a video on this channel that discusses how horses and other animals demonstrate predictive behavior before major weather events, and you might want to check it out. The mare nickered softly and pressed her nose against his chest, and Garrett stood with her in the gathering dark until the cold drove him inside. He tried once more to warn them on the morning of October 22nd, when he encountered the town blacksmith on the road outside the general store. The man's name was Peter Vogel, a German immigrant like Garrett's grandmother, and Garrett had hoped that Shared Heritage might purchase a hearing. "The signs are everywhere," Garrett said, keeping his voice low so that passers-by would not overhear and add to the rumors of his strangeness. "The beaver dams, the early migration, the thickness of the animal pelts. The elk do not lie, and neither do the caterpillars. This winter will be unlike anything this valley has seen." Vogel looked at him with something that might have been pity if it had not been so close to contempt. "Ashcroft's almanac says mild winter," he said, as though repeating a catechism. "The almanac is calculated by educated men who study the stars and the weather. You trust animals over educated men, Holbrook?" "I trust what I see," Garrett replied. "And what I see tells me to prepare for the worst." Vogel shook his head. "Perhaps that is why you live in a hole in the ground, because you see things that are not there. The animals are simply moving, as they do every year. The beaver dams are high because the creek ran low this summer and they need to compensate. There are explanations for everything, Holbrook, if a man has the sense to look for them." He turned and walked away without waiting for a response, and Garrett stood alone in the street as the morning wind cut through his coat like a knife. Around him, the people of Timber Creek went about their business, buying and selling and gossiping, their eyes sliding past him as though he were a shadow or a ghost. They had their explanations, their almanacs and their educated men, their comfortable certainties that insulated them from the messages the land was screaming. Garrett returned to the gopher hole and continued his preparations. He split wood until his shoulders burned and stacked it in the shelter he had built for Ivy, enough to fuel the oven for 4 months of continuous firing. He checked the seals on his flour bins and the weights on his root cellar doors. He inventoried his coal supply and calculated consumption rates, scratching figures in the dirt floor with a stick. He greased the hinges on his heavy door and tested the shutters on his windows, ensuring that everything moved smoothly, that nothing would fail when failure meant death. The last week of October brought a false spring, 3 days of unseasonable warmth that melted the early snow and coaxed the people of Timber Creek into believing that the worst had passed before it began. Knox Ashcroft held a celebration on the porch of the Timber Creek Hotel, raising a glass of whiskey to toast the mild winter his almanac had predicted. The sound of laughter carried on the warm breeze, and Garrett heard it from his hillside as he worked, tightening bolts and checking stores, his face grim. The warmth was a lie, and he knew it. His grandmother had spoken of such tricks, the breathing spaces that winter allowed before closing its jaws. The land was exhaling, preparing for the long inhalation that would follow, and when it drew breath again, it would draw deep. On the morning of November 1st, Garrett woke to find ice crystals forming on the inside of his windows despite the banked fire in his oven. He rose and walked to the south-facing glass and looked out upon a valley transformed. A skin of frost covered everything, glittering in the early light like a shroud sewn with diamonds, and the temperature had dropped 30 degrees in the night. To the north, over the peaks of the Absaroka Range, the clouds were building. They were black as coal dust and heavy as grief, and they moved with a purpose that spoke of something more than weather. Garrett watched them come, his breath fogging the cold glass, and knew that the counting had begun. If you find this kind of frontier survival narrative compelling, there's a video on this channel that explores other stories of communities facing natural disasters and the individuals who saw them coming. He spent that day in final preparation. He brought Ivy inside the longhouse proper, leading her through the wide door and into the space he had prepared for her, where the warmth of the oven would keep her alive even in the deepest cold. She went willingly, as though she had been waiting for this moment, and settled into her corner with a patience that bordered on resignation. Garrett sealed the door behind her and stood in the center of his creation, surrounded by the provisions that represented 14 months of labor and a lifetime of inherited knowledge. The walls rose around him, 3 feet thick, and the sod roof pressed down like a living thing, and the earth itself embraced the structure in a grip that would hold against any wind, any snow, any fury the sky might unleash. Outside, the black clouds descended from the mountains, and the temperature continued to fall. Tomorrow was November 2nd, and the people of Timber Creek would wake to find that their almanacs had lied, that their educated men had failed them, that the only soul in the valley who had seen the truth was the madman who lived in a hole in the ground. Garrett Holbrook sat beside his oven, its warmth pressing against his back like the hand of a friend, and waited for the starving winter to begin. The second day of November dawned with a silence so complete that it seemed the world had stopped breathing. Garrett rose from his narrow bed and crossed to the south window, his bare feet finding the stone floor cold despite the oven's warmth. What he saw through the frost-rimed glass stopped him where he stood. The black clouds had descended in the night, swallowing the peaks of the Absaroka Range and settling into the valley like a beast making its den. The temperature, which had dropped 30 degrees the previous night, had fallen another 20. The frost that had sparkled like diamonds yesterday had become something harder, something that gripped every surface with fingers that would not release until spring. Garrett pressed his palm against the glass and felt the cold bite through his skin, felt it reach for the warmth in his blood with a hunger that was almost personal. By noon, the first snow began to fall. It did not fall gently. It came sideways, driven by a wind that howled down from the mountains with a voice that sounded almost human in its fury. The flakes were small and hard, more ice than snow, and they struck the windows of the longhouse with a sound like sand thrown against glass. Garrett stood at the window and watched as the world beyond his walls disappeared into a wall of white, watched as the road to town vanished and the trees became ghosts, and the sky and the ground merged into a single howling void. The blizzard of November 14th arrived with the force of an invading army. For 5 days and 6 nights, the storm raged without cease. The wind reached speeds that stripped shingles from roofs and tore boards from walls, that drove snow through cracks too small to see and piled drifts 20 feet high against the windward sides of buildings. The temperature fell to 42 degrees below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes, cold enough to turn breath to ice before it left the body, cold enough to kill cattle standing in the fields before they had time to lie down. The weather became a predator. It hunted through the streets of Timber Creek like a wolf pack, seeking the weak and the unprepared, finding them in their beds and at their hearths, and in the spaces between their walls where the cold crept in like water through a cracked dam. It found the Timber Creek Hotel first, driving snow through the gaps around its grand windows and freezing the pipes that brought water to its upper floors. It found the general store next, collapsing a section of roof under the weight of accumulated snow and exposing the inventory to temperatures that would ruin everything they touched. It found Knox Ashcroft's Grand Victorian on the morning of November 17th. The house had been the pride of Timber Creek, a three-story monument to ambition and wealth with gingerbread trim and a wraparound porch and windows imported from Denver at a cost that could have built 4 ordinary homes. But the Victorian had been designed for show rather than survival, its walls thin and its foundations shallow, and when the sustained winds reached 50 miles per hour, the house began to die. The first sign was a crack that ran the length of the parlor ceiling, a crack that widened with each gust until plaster began to fall like snow inside the house. The second sign was the groan of the frame itself, a sound that Knox Ashcroft would later describe as the voice of his ruin. The third sign was the wall. The east wall of the Grand Victorian split from foundation to roofline on the evening of November 17th, opening the house to the killing cold like a wound that would not close. Knox Ashcroft and his wife Margaret fled with their children to the servants' quarters at the back of the property, a small building that had been constructed with more concern for function than appearance, and which, by virtue of its low profile and solid construction, survived where the mansion did not. The cattle were already dead. The herd that represented Knox Ashcroft's fortune, the 1,200 head that grazed the 12,000 acres of the Broken A Ranch, began dying on November 15th. The ranch hands found the first bodies in the draws where the cattle had gathered seeking shelter, found them standing upright as though frozen in the act of waiting for rescue that would never come. By November 20th, when the storm finally paused to draw breath before its next assault, the count had reached 400 dead. By December 1st, it would reach 800. By Christmas, Knox Ashcroft would be a rancher with a ruined house and a herd that existed only in memory and in debt. Inside the longhouse, Garrett Holbrook fed his oven and waited. The structure his neighbors had mocked held against the fury of the storm without complaint. The 3-foot walls of mortared stone absorbed the cold and refused to transmit it inward. The 18 inches of sod on the roof, now buried under 7 feet of snow, provided insulation so effective that Garrett found himself reducing the fire rather than building it up. The south-facing windows, set deep in their stone frames and protected by heavy shutters, admitted enough light on clear days to read by while losing almost no heat to the cold beyond. Ivy stood in her corner, calm and warm, her breath adding moisture to the air that Garrett's grandmother had taught him to value. The cistern provided water. The root cellars provided food. The oven provided heat and bread, and the smell of that bread rose from the chimney and drifted across the valley like a promise that some in Timber Creek could not yet bring themselves to believe. The deaths began in the 3rd week. Tommy Reeves was 7 years old. He had hair the color of summer wheat and a gap between his front teeth that his mother said would close when his adult teeth came in. He liked to collect stones from the creek bed and arrange them in patterns that only he understood. And he asked questions about everything he saw with a curiosity that exhausted the adults around him while filling them with hope for the child he would become. On the night of November 23rd, when the second blizzard struck with a fury that exceeded the first, Tommy Reeves woke in his bed to find that the fire had died and his breath was freezing before it left his lips. He rose and walked to his mother's room, seeking warmth that no longer existed in the small house where the Reeves family had lived for 3 generations. His mother found him in the morning, sitting on the floor beside her bed, his small hand reaching toward hers, frozen in a gesture of trust that had been answered too late. The widow Patterson was 63 years old. She had lived in Timber Creek since before it had a name, had buried a husband and 2 sons and a daughter who died giving birth to the grandchildren who now shared her home. She was known for her sharp tongue and her generous heart, for the way she would scold a neighbor in one breath and feed them in the next, for the quilts she made from scraps of fabric that she saved as though each piece held a memory too precious to discard. When the cold became killing and the blankets ran short, Elizabeth Patterson gave hers to her grandchildren. She wrapped them in wool and cotton and the love that had sustained her through 63 years of frontier life, and then she sat in her chair beside the dead fire and waited for the morning. Her grandchildren found her there when the sun rose, her face peaceful, her hands folded in her lap, her body cold as the air that had claimed her. Samuel Chen had come to Timber Creek from San Francisco, where his father had worked building the railroad that would eventually connect the coasts. He had opened a laundry service because it was work he knew, and because the miners and ranchers of the territory needed clean clothes but lacked the time or inclination to wash them themselves. He was 41 years old, unmarried, quiet in a way that the townspeople sometimes mistook for unfriendliness. His shop was a small building near the edge of town, built quickly and cheaply by a previous owner who had cared more about speed than strength. On the night of December 2nd, when the accumulated snow reached weights that no one had thought to calculate, the roof of Samuel Chen's shop collapsed while he slept in the small room at the back where he made his home. The townspeople would not find his body until spring, when the melt revealed what the snow had hidden, when the dead of that night came due in full. Inside the longhouse, Garrett baked bread and counted days. He had calculated his provisions for a winter of 4 months, and as December wore on, he recalculated for 5, then 6. The root cellars held firm. The flour remained dry. The oven consumed wood at the rate he had predicted, no more and no less, and the warmth it provided kept the interior of the longhouse at a temperature that would have seemed miraculous to the freezing souls in the valley below. Ivy ate her hay and drank her water and stood in her corner with a patience that Garrett found himself envying. The mayor had no questions about the justice of their situation, no doubts about the choices that had led them to this moment of warmth while others froze. She simply existed, grateful and present, and Garrett tried to learn from her example. The general store's inventory froze solid in the first week of December. Hiram Weston had built his business on the assumption that supply wagons would continue running through the winter months, that the railroad would resume service before his shelves went bare, that the weather would behave according to the patterns he had observed in his 12 years of residence in Timber Creek. He had been wrong about all of it. The supply wagons were stranded somewhere between Casper and the territory, their drivers either dead or waiting out the storm in whatever shelter they had found. The railroad had suspended service indefinitely, and the tracks themselves were buried under drifts so deep that they would not be cleared until April. The weather had departed from every pattern that any living person had observed, and the general store's inventory, which had seemed adequate in October, was catastrophically insufficient by December. The canned goods froze and burst their seams, spilling their contents into frozen puddles that would never be recovered. The flour absorbed moisture from the cold air and hardened into blocks that could not be sifted or measured. The salt pork froze so thoroughly that it could not be cut without a saw. The coffee beans, stored in barrels that offered no protection against the temperatures inside the ruined building, became bitter and unusable. What had represented months of sustenance for the community became, in a matter of weeks, a monument to assumptions that the winter had exposed as hollow. Hiram Weston, who had refused Garrett credit at Margaret Ashcroft's instruction, found himself standing in his ruined store on the morning of December 3rd, surrounded by the spoiled remains of his livelihood, with nothing to offer the desperate souls who lined up outside his door each morning seeking food that no longer existed. The shelves that had once bent under the weight of plenty now stood empty, their bare boards a testament to the gap between preparation and reality. It was on that morning that Pastor William Donnelly made his decision. Donnelly was 48 years old, a Methodist minister who had served the congregation of Timber Creek for 7 years. He had participated in the social exclusion of Garrett Holbrook without enthusiasm but also without objection, allowing Margaret Ashcroft's campaign to proceed while he focused on matters he considered more central to his calling. He had attended the council meeting where Knox Ashcroft coined the nickname that followed Garrett through the streets. He had laughed, though not loudly, and he had said nothing in defense of a man who had done nothing to warrant defense except choose to build differently than his neighbors. These memories weighed on William Donnelly as he stood in the frozen street on the morning of December 3rd, watching the line of hungry souls form outside a store that had nothing to give them. The smell of bread drifted down from the hillside. Donnelly had noticed it for days, that faint aroma of warmth and sustenance that seemed to mock the suffering below. It came from the stone chimney that rose from the hillside like a finger pointing at heaven, from the structure that everyone called the Gopher Hole, from the home of the man they had scorned and excluded and dismissed. The smell spoke of heat and plenty, of oven fires that burned through the coldest nights, of food that would sustain life when life seemed impossible to sustain. It spoke of everything that Timber Creek lacked and everything that Garrett Holbrook had built. William Donnelly climbed the hillside on the morning of December 3rd, his boots breaking through the crust of ice that covered the snow, his breath freezing in his beard, his heart heavy with the weight of words he had not spoken and actions he had not taken. The path to the longhouse was nearly invisible, buried under drifts that reached his waist in places, but the smoke rising from the chimney provided direction, and the smell of bread provided motivation. He climbed for 20 minutes before he reached the door, a massive construction of oak planks reinforced with iron strapping, set into the hillside as though it were the entrance to a fortress rather than a home. He knocked and waited, his hat in his hands. The door opened and warmth poured out like water from a broken dam, warmth so profound after weeks of cold that Donnelly nearly wept at the sensation of it against his frozen face. Garrett Holbrook stood in the doorway, his face calm, his eyes steady, his expression neither triumphant nor resentful. He looked at the minister who had laughed at the council meeting, who had participated in the exclusion without objection, who came now with hat in hand because there was nowhere else to go. Garrett stepped aside and gestured toward the interior of the longhouse. "Come in," he said. "There is bread." Donnelly entered, and the door closed behind him, and the rescue of Timber Creek began. The interior of the longhouse struck William Donnelly with the force of revelation. He had imagined, in the way that people imagine things they have never seen, a crude cave dwelling fit for animals and madmen. What he found instead was a space of careful design and evident purpose, warm as a summer afternoon, lit by the gray light that filtered through the deep-set windows and the amber glow of oil lamps hung at intervals along the stone walls. The baking oven dominated the eastern end of the structure, its massive form built into the hillside itself, radiating a heat that seemed to press against his frozen skin like a blessing. Shelves lined the walls, and on those shelves sat jars and crocks and covered containers that spoke of preparation so thorough it bordered on prophecy. The Grullamere ivy stood in a corner fitted with straw bedding and a water trough, and she turned her head to regard the visitor with calm eyes before returning to her hay. Garrett led the minister to a wooden bench near the oven and placed before him a round loaf of bread, still warm from baking, a crock of butter, and a cup of water drawn from the cistern beneath the floor. Donnelly ate without speaking, without pausing, consumed by a hunger he had not fully acknowledged until food appeared before him. The bread was dense and rich, made with flour that had been stored properly in conditions that kept it dry and fresh, and it tasted to the starving minister like grace itself. "There are others," Donnelly said when he could speak again. "Families with children, the elderly, the sick." "I know." Garrett poured more water into the minister's cup. "How many can walk?" "Some, perhaps half of those who remain. Send them in groups of 20. No more at one time, or there will not be room to warm them properly. They should come at first light and stay until noon, then return to make room for the next group. I will bake through the night." If you are curious about how people in the past organized community survival during extreme weather events, there is a video on this channel that examines those social dynamics in detail. The system that emerged over the following weeks operated with a precision that surprised everyone except Garrett himself. Each morning, a group of survivors would make the difficult climb to the longhouse, guided by the smoke from the chimney and the smell of bread that drifted down the hillside like a promise. They entered frozen and desperate and left 4 hours later with warmth in their bodies and food in their stomachs, carrying loaves of bread wrapped in cloth to sustain them until they could return. The root cellars yielded their contents according to a schedule Garrett had calculated on the second day of the rescue, measuring what remained against what would be needed, stretching provisions that he had laid in for 12 across a community of hundreds. The teaching began almost immediately. Garrett showed the survivors how to read the temperature of the oven by the color of its stones, how to shape the loaves for even baking, how to time the firing so that warmth persisted through the coldest hours of the night. He explained the principles of earth insulation to men who had mocked him for building underground, drew diagrams in flour dust on the wooden table, spoke in patient detail about thermal mass and moisture control and the angle of south-facing windows. Some listened out of genuine interest. Others listened because there was nothing else to do while waiting for the bread to bake. A few listened because they had begun to understand that the knowledge this strange man possessed was the difference between life and death, and they did not intend to face another winter unprepared. The death count stabilized in the second week of December. Before the rescue began, Timber Creek had been losing 2 or 3 souls per week to cold and hunger and accidents caused by desperation. After the longhouse opened its doors, the dying slowed to a trickle, and then stopped altogether. The community would lose 17 people in total during the starving winter, including young Tommy Reeves and the widow Patterson and Samuel Chen, whose body would not be found until spring. 17 out of 847. It was a tragedy by any measure, but it was not the catastrophe that had seemed inevitable in those early days of December when the temperature dropped past 40 below, and the supplies ran out and hope itself appeared to freeze solid in the hearts of the survivors. Knox Ashcroft came to the longhouse on December 15th, though he did not climb the hill himself. His foreman made the journey instead, a taciturn man named Greer, who delivered his employer's message with the discomfort of someone required to speak words he found distasteful. Ashcroft requested provisions for his household. Ashcroft would pay whatever price was asked. Ashcroft trusted that past disagreements could be set aside in light of present circumstances. Garrett listened to the message, and then he looked at the foreman and he said, "Tell your employer that his family is welcome here, as all families are welcome. There is no price. There are no disagreements to set aside. Tell him to come himself if he wishes to eat my bread." Ashcroft did not come himself. His wife Margaret did, on December 20th, climbing the hillside with her 3 children and her household servants, her face set in an expression that might have been shame or might have been simply cold. Garrett welcomed her as he welcomed everyone, with bread and warmth and water from the cistern, and he said nothing about council meetings or refused credit or social exclusions organized with surgical precision. Margaret Ashcroft sat on the same wooden bench where dozens of others had sat before her, and she fed her children bread baked by the man she had worked so hard to ostracize, and whatever thoughts moved behind her eyes she kept to herself. Knox Ashcroft came on Christmas Day. He climbed the hill alone, without his foreman or his family, and he stood before the door of the longhouse for several minutes before he found the will to knock. Garrett opened the door and stood aside without speaking, and Ashcroft entered, and for the first time the wealthy rancher saw with his own eyes the structure he had called a gopher hole, a cave for a fool playing in the dirt like a child. The warmth struck him first, as it struck everyone, that profound and almost painful sensation of heat after weeks of cold that cut through wool and leather and flesh to freeze the very marrow. Then his eyes adjusted to the interior light, and he saw the construction itself, the precise stonework of the walls, the massive oven built into the hillside, the shelves lined with provisions that he could not have purchased at any price from any merchant in the territory. He saw the survivors gathered near the fire, families whose mortgages he held, men who had worked his fields and built his fences and deferred to him in all things because he held their futures in his hands. They looked at him without expression, and he looked at them, and between them lay the terrible mathematics of that winter, the calculation that showed his grand house split, and his cattle frozen and his imported goods worthless, while this strange man's earthen shelter sustained the community he had claimed to lead. "There is bread," Garrett said, the same words he had spoken to every visitor since the rescue began. "Sit and eat." Ashcroft sat. He ate. He said nothing, and Garrett asked nothing. And when the rancher left an hour later, he walked down the hillside with bread wrapped in cloth and the certain knowledge that something fundamental had shifted in Timber Creek, something that could never be shifted back. The gathering came in April. The snow had begun to retreat by then, revealing the wreckage of buildings that had collapsed under the weight of drifts and the frozen bodies of cattle that had died standing in fields now brown with mud. The railroad had resumed service on March 15th, and supply wagons had followed a week later, and the terrible scarcity of winter had given way to the difficult abundance of spring. But the survivors of Timber Creek did not scatter to their separate homes and their separate concerns as they might have done in any ordinary year. Instead, they gathered on the slope below the longhouse, 217 souls who had eaten Garrett Holbrook's bread and warmed themselves beside Garrett Holbrook's fire, and they waited for something that had no name but that everyone understood was necessary. Pastor Donnelly had organized the gathering, though the impulse for it came from the community itself, from whispered conversations in the longhouse during the long months of rescue, from the weight of words unspoken and debts unacknowledged. The minister stood before the crowd and spoke briefly about gratitude and humility, and the obligations that bound one soul to another, and then he stepped aside and the first of the confessors rose to speak. Knox Ashcroft stood before his neighbors with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above their heads. His face, which had been ruddy with health and wealth in the autumn, was gaunt now, marked by the winter in ways that no amount of spring sunshine would fully erase. His voice, when he found it, came out cracked and uncertain, stripped of the commanding tone that had carried his pronouncements through council meetings and contract negotiations for decades. "I stood in this town's council chamber on the 23rd of September, he began, and I called this place a gopher hole. I said that Mr. Holbrook was a grown man playing in the dirt like a child, that he was building a cave instead of a proper house, that what came next would be eating worms." He paused, and his throat worked, and when he continued his voice was barely above a whisper. I was proud of those words. I thought them clever. I thought they showed the community what manner of fool had come among us, and I expected everyone to laugh, and they did laugh, and I was satisfied. He lowered his eyes to meet the faces of his neighbors. Some looked away. Others held his gaze with expressions that ranged from sympathy to accusation to simple exhaustion. My house split open on the 17th of November. The timbers that I had ordered from Portland that had cost me more than this man's entire property, they snapped like dry kindling when the cold found the moisture in their grain. I watched my cattle freeze standing upright in fields where I had boasted they would grow fat. 12,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, and it became a graveyard. I had 1,000 head of cattle in October. By February, I had fewer than 200. The rest I left for the wolves and the crows because there was no way to bury them and no point in trying. You might find it useful to watch a video on this channel about how historic ranchers dealt with catastrophic livestock losses and what recovery looked like in those circumstances. Ashcroft's voice steadied as he continued, finding its way toward the words he had come to speak. I would have lost my children in that winter. I would have lost my wife. The house that I built above the ground, the proper house with clapboard walls and shingled roof, it could not keep them warm when the temperature dropped to 40 below. The store where I had instructed the owner to refuse this man credit, it had nothing to sell us when we went hungry. The neighbors I had organized against him, they had no provisions to share because they had trusted the pattern of ordinary winters and the pattern broke. His eyes found Garrett, who stood apart from the crowd, his face revealing nothing. This man fed my children when I could not. He warmed my wife when my own house had become a tomb of ice. He did these things without asking for payment, without demanding acknowledgement, without reminding me of the words I had spoken from that council chamber. He gave bread to the people I had turned against him, and he asked nothing in return except that they learn what he had to teach. Ashcroft's voice finally broke, and he stood silent for a moment, gathering himself. I have no right to ask. I know that I have no right. But I ask forgiveness from this man and from this community for the cruelty of my words and the consequences of my pride. He sat down, and the silence held for a long moment, and then Margaret Ashcroft rose to take his place. Her confession followed the same pattern, spoken in a voice that shook but did not fail. She quoted her own instructions to Hiram Weston, the specific words she had used to ensure that Garrett Holbrook would receive no credit at the general store. She described the hunger of her children during the weeks before the rescue, the terror of watching them grow thin and listless while the provisions she had taken for granted disappeared. She acknowledged that the bread Garrett baked had kept her family alive, and she asked forgiveness with tears streaming down her face, tears that froze in the April wind before they could fall from her chin. Peter Vogel, the blacksmith, spoke next. He had laughed at Garrett's warnings about the coming winter, had dismissed the signs that any careful observer could have read in the behavior of animals and the thickness of their coats. "You trust animals over educated men?" he had said, and he repeated those words now with the bitter taste of humiliation in his mouth. He described the collapse of his forge when the drifts grew too heavy for the roof, described the loss of tools and materials that had taken him 15 years to accumulate, described the days he had spent in Garrett's longhouse learning to read an oven's temperature by the color of its stones. He asked forgiveness, and his voice cracked on the final words, and he sat down with his face in his hands. Hiram Weston rose, the general store owner who had refused Garrett credit at Margaret Ashcroft's instruction. He spoke of his ruined inventory, of flour hardened to blocks and canned goods burst open by the cold, of the empty shelves that had greeted the desperate souls who came to him each morning seeking food that no longer existed. He spoke of his shame at having followed Margaret Ashcroft's commands without question, at having valued the approval of wealthy customers over the simple justice of treating every man fairly. He asked forgiveness, and when he sat down his hands were trembling. Elwood Sutter, the coal merchant who had refused to sell to Garrett, was the last of the confessors. He had survived the winter in his own shop, burning the coal he had refused to sell, warming himself while others froze. The guilt of it had eaten at him through the long months of cold, and now it poured out of him in words that stumbled over each other in their haste to be spoken. He had watched from his window as people climbed the hillside to the longhouse, had smelled the bread baking in Garrett's oven while he huddled beside his own fire with provisions that could have been shared. He asked forgiveness, and his voice was so quiet that the people at the back of the crowd had to lean forward to hear him. When the confessors had finished, when the silence had stretched long enough that people began to shift and murmur, Garrett Holbrook walked forward to stand where they had stood. His face was calm, as it had been throughout the winter, and his hands hung loose at his sides, and he looked out at the crowd with eyes that held no triumph and no resentment. "My grandmother used to say that winter makes equals of us all," he began, and his voice carried clearly in the still air. "She was a woman of 16 when she came to this country, speaking no English, carrying nothing but a Bible and a knowledge of stone. She built her home into a hillside in Virginia because she knew that the earth remembers warmth longer than the air. She survived winters that killed her neighbors by the score, and when those neighbors came to her for help, she helped them. because she understood that survival is not a competition, but a shared labor. He paused, and his eyes moved across the faces of the crowd, lingering on each of the confessors in turn. I have heard your words today. I have heard the mockery you now regret, and the suffering you have endured, and the acknowledgement that the provisions I stored and the shelter I built made the difference between life and death for many of you. I have heard your requests for forgiveness, and I have considered them carefully. The crowd held its breath. The only sound was the wind moving across the muddy slope, and the distant calling of birds returned from their winter migration. I will not say that I forgive you. The words fell like stones into still water. Several of the confessors flinched. Margaret Ashcroft brought her hand to her mouth. I will not say it because forgiveness of that sort is not mine to give so easily. You did not injure me when you mocked my building or excluded me from your society or refused me credit at your stores. You injured yourselves, and you injured the community that looked to you for leadership. The dead of this winter, Tommy Reeves and Elizabeth Patterson and Samuel Chen and the others, they cannot grant forgiveness because they are gone. The survivors who ate my bread and warmed themselves at my fire, they have their own decisions to make about what was done to them when their leaders followed pride instead of prudence. He looked at Knox Ashcroft, who sat with his head bowed, and his expression softened almost imperceptibly. What I can offer is this. My grandmother taught me what she knew because she believed that knowledge hoarded is knowledge lost. She taught me to read the earth and the weather and the behavior of animals because she understood that these skills could save lives, not just my own, but the lives of anyone willing to learn. I honored her memory this winter when I opened my door to you, and I will honor it now with an offer that asks nothing of your pride. He gestured toward the hillside behind him, toward the longhouse that rose from the earth like something that had always been there. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn, not as penance for what was said or done, but because the knowledge deserves to survive. Build your homes into hillsides if you choose. Learn to read the signs that the land offers to anyone with eyes to see. Prepare for winters that break the patterns of ordinary years, because such winters will come again, and when they come, the prepared will survive and the unprepared will not. There's a video on this channel that discusses generational knowledge transfer in frontier communities and how skills passed from mentors to students shaped American settlement patterns. He fell silent, and the silence stretched. And then Pastor Donnelly began to applaud, and others joined him, and the sound of clapping hands rose from the gathered crowd and rolled up the hillside like a wave. The years that followed the starving winter transformed Timber Creek in ways that no one could have predicted. Garrett Holbrook kept his promise. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1888, he led groups of townspeople through the construction of pyramid structures along the hillsides that bordered the valley. He taught them to select sites with southern exposure and natural windbreaks, to calculate the angle of winter sun, to mix mortar according to the formula his grandmother had perfected in Virginia 50 years before. He showed them how to build ovens that would hold their warmth through the coldest nights, how to construct root cellars that would preserve food through months of isolation, how to read the signs that the land offered to anyone patient enough to learn. Knox Ashcroft became his most devoted student. The rancher who had coined the mocking nickname worked alongside laborers and homesteaders, his hands blistered and his back aching, learning skills that his wealth had never required him to develop. He rebuilt his own home according to Garrett's principles, and when neighbors came to see the construction, he explained it in terms that echoed his former teacher's words. The transformation in him was genuine and lasting, and those who had known him before the starving winter sometimes failed to recognize the humble man who emerged from it. The term gopher hole remained in local vocabulary, but its meaning changed completely. Building a gopher hole became shorthand for thorough preparation, for choosing function over appearance, for heeding the wisdom of those who understood the land. Parents instructed their children to think like a gopher when planning for uncertain futures, and the phrase carried none of the mockery that Ashcroft had intended when he coined it. The insult had become a compliment, the sneer had become a standard, and the community that had once scorned Garrett Holbrook's methods now embraced them as a matter of civic pride. By 1927, 40 years after the starving winter, 17 Burma structures dotted the hillsides around Timber Creek. Some were simple root cellars and storage buildings. Others were full homes, lived in year-round by families who had learned the principles from Garrett himself or from students who carried his teaching forward. The original longhouse had been maintained and expanded, its massive walls repaired whenever weather or time demanded attention, its oven fired regularly to ensure that the knowledge of its operation would not be lost. Garrett Holbrook lived to see the transformation he had set in motion. He never remarried, never sought the social standing that his role in the community's survival might have earned him, never accepted payment for the teaching that became his primary occupation in the decades after the starving winter. He lived in the longhouse with his mare Ivy until the mare died in 1903, and he buried her on the slope above the south-facing windows where the spring sun would warm the earth over her bones. The grave marker he carved himself, just as he had carved Sarah's marker so many years before, and on it he wrote simply, "Ivy, faithful friend, 1881 to 1903. The inscription above the door of the longhouse appeared in 1900 when Garrett hired a stonemason from Casper to carve the words he had carried in his heart since boyhood. The carving took 3 days, and when it was finished, Garrett stood before it for the better part of an hour, just as he had stood before Sarah's grave all those years ago, remembering the woman who had given him the knowledge that had saved a community. Garrett Holbrook died in 1921 in his bed in the longhouse, surrounded by 31 people who called him teacher. He was 77 years old, and his hands still bore the calluses of the work he had done all his life, and his face still held the expression of calm patience that had greeted every visitor since that first morning when William Donnelly came seeking bread. They buried him beside Ivy, on the slope above the windows, and the funeral was attended by more than 300 souls, nearly half the population of the town he had helped to save. If you want to learn more about how frontier legacies shaped modern communities in the American West, there's a video on this channel that explores several remarkable examples. The longhouse still stands today, maintained by a preservation society founded in 1935. The walls that Garrett built with his own hands remain solid after more than a century, the mortar his grandmother taught him to mix holding the stones together through winters that have tested but never broken the structure. The oven has been fired thousands of times since the starving winter, and each firing adds to the heat held in the hillside, contributing to the thermal mass that keeps the interior warm when the world outside turns cold. The south-facing windows still catch the winter sun, and the cistern still flows with water from the spring that Garrett diverted through its stone-lined channel in 1886. Visitors come throughout the year to see the place where a single man's preparation saved a community. They walk through the door that Garrett built and stand in the space where hundreds of survivors warmed themselves during the coldest winter in Wyoming history. They read the displays that explain the principles of earth-insulated construction and the techniques of long-term food preservation. They look at the photographs of Garrett Holbrook that hang on the walls, showing a man whose face reveals little but whose eyes hold a depth of experience that no photograph can fully capture. Above the door, carved into a block of native sandstone, the inscription remains as clear as the day the stonemason finished his work. 2 lines, one in the German his grandmother spoke and one in the English she learned, expressing the truth she taught him before he was old enough to understand its full meaning. Die Erde erinnert sich / the Earth remembers, 1886. The date marks the year Garrett broke ground on the longhouse, the year he began building the structure that would shelter him through the starving winter and for 35 years thereafter. It marks the beginning of his answer to the grief of losing Sarah, the beginning of the work that would define the rest of his life, the beginning of the legacy that would outlast him by generations. Grandmother Elsa would have recognized every stone of this place. She would have recognized the angle of the walls, and the thickness of the mortar, and the deep-set windows that catch the winter light. She would have recognized the oven built into the hillside, the root cellars lined with shelves, the sleeping quarters fitted into the walls like berths on a ship. She would have recognized the knowledge that her grandson carried forward, the skills she taught him in that long-ago longhouse in Virginia, the understanding that the earth itself is the best shelter against the cruelty of winter. More than anything, she would have understood why the inscription above the door says what it says, because she spoke those words to a young boy who listened and remembered, and because the earth remembers everything that we trust it with.